Steve Altition, Director of Client Partnerships here at Pacific Cascade Legal. And today I'm here with neuroeducator and co-author of Your Child Learns Differently, Now What? Betsy Hill, to discuss the importance of a child's cognitive readiness to learn, how to identify your child's readiness, and working together with your co-parents to help develop a growth mindset. Wow, that's a lot. So Betsy, how are you doing today?
I am great, Steve. So nice to be here.
Oh, I'm so happy you're here. This is really interesting stuff. And before we start diving into it, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, the most important thing about me is I raised three boys, and they were as different can be, very different learners. I always say about them that they never would have met if they weren't brothers. That's how different they are. And I'm a former teacher, taught high school for a while, and then defected, as many teachers do, but have been so interested really since college in how the brain learns. And there wasn't much science back then, but in the last 15, 20 years, there's been a lot of science, and it's been just an amazing journey to learn. If I knew half of what I know now, back then, my teaching and my parenting would have been different.
Yeah, I really love when I was looking at some of your stuff, the term neuroeducator. I mean, it's like we don't always think of that. I mean, it is actually the brain that learns, and so I really think that's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it is the brain that learns. And so and really every teacher should have that information, but it is still the case that most teacher preparation programs do not ever mention the word brain. So they don't really talk about a lot of things that help teachers, but not necessarily really what's going on in the brain when the brain is learning and how to take advantage of that knowledge. And that's why I coined the term neuroeducator, is that it's someone who is as committed to education as teachers generally are, but also has studied and understands the brain and how it learns and how we can really leverage that information and help create the kinds of learning experiences that are likely to result in sticky learning. Someone the other day was talking to me about their brain didn't feel very sticky. It couldn't hold on to information. And that's what we want. We want sticky brains. We want brains that can hold on to information and do things with it and think about it. And that's what our job as teachers are, really.
I love it. I love it. So that kind of leads to the I guess obvious question. I always start with an obvious question. I don't know why, but we talk about cognitive learning and the importance of it. So let's just kind of start with what is cognitive learning and what kind of skills are involved.
So cognitive skills is the term. So the cognitive processes, there are a lot of different terms, but the word cognitive is really about learning and thinking. And cognitive skills are the processes our brains use to take in information from the outside world, to organize it, store it, retrieve it, process it, make sense of it, make decisions with it, retrieve it later when we need to do it. So it's the all those mental processes that involve things like various attention skills. There's a special group of cognitive skills called executive functions. A lot of people are hearing that term later because these skills are so important in the learning, but in everyday life. And they're what help us organize and manage ourselves and get our work done. And then other things like visual and auditory processing speed. When we work with families, we work on 43 cognitive skills. So it's not just a simple, oh, you're either dumb or smart. That thinking has just no longer even relevant because there's so many different processes that are involved and they all have to work together. So these are really the foundation for learning. When we have a solid foundation, then we can build, then we can learn to read, learn to write, learn to do math, all the rest of the curriculum, as well as be more socially competent, to have the ability to to organize ourselves, keep track of our selves and all that kind of thing.
It kind of makes me think of when I go out and work in the yard. I work way too hard, and I come in and everything hurts. And it's like my muscles and my back hurt, my muscle and my arm hurts, and I kind of feel, is it kind of like that all these things you talked about, attention, visual, auditory, are they located like in different parts of the brain? Is this kind of like massaging and the whole brain kind of a deal you're talking?
Yeah, a little bit. Some of these processes happen in more discrete areas of the brain, but a lot of it's distributed all over the brain, and it's the overall brain connectivity and the ability of all these things to work together that is really what is the most correlated with intelligence. And that's something people have always been looking for. Where does this little piece sit and where does that little piece sit? But the best prediction is whether you can get all of these pieces working together. So sometimes it's sort of like, when you have departments in a company that are all, really, really good, and they're all working really well, except they're not working together. And so one does something and then it drops and the customer never gets that product or whatever it might be. And the same is true of our brains. So we often work with kids who are really, really smart. And every kid is really smart in some way. But that it just isn't all working together. And so when we can get that to happen, then just learning becomes easier. It's sort of like, your yard work will be a little bit easier and you won't come in as uncomfortable and as in need of that massage as you do.
Yeah. You talked a little bit about the higher order of executive functions, and is that something that you can work on? Is that
Absolutely
to actually work to get better?
Absolutely. So when I talk about higher order executive functions, it reads a lot, the list reads a lot like 21st century skills. So if you may have heard that, but it's like things like planning, collaboration, communication, just how you organize and work with others, all of those kinds of things. And those require, you need to know a lot of things, but to also have these various cognitive skills. So if you think about it, what we do in the workplace or what we do in school, and you look at something like cognitive flexibility, which is one of the 3 core executive functions, but plays a big role in all of the others. And cognitive flexibility means that you can shift gears and adapt and take a different approach when you need to, when things change or when your first approach to something doesn't work. And if you think about what that is like in the workplace, not everything works right the first time, or the first plan you have doesn't accomplish it, or the first product to market is not necessarily the best. And that process of learning from that experience and iterating and going through it again, which is the essence. I mean, that's what Apple has done so magnificently in their product development, is they learn from putting things out in front of us, and we use it and we tell them about how we experience it, and then they do the next generation. And it's really, all of us are like that. If we, and you mentioned growth mindset earlier, that's really the essence of growth mindset, is that you're not going to necessarily get it right the first time. A growth mindset is the mindset that somebody has when they understand that intelligence isn't fixed, that it can be developed. So all of these things, our ability to analyze and to think higher order thoughts and to be critical thinkers and to be collaborators, all of that we can strengthen. First of all, by strengthening these underlying skills, the foundation, and then by working on those others to improve how we can do those.
And am I right in assuming that you can improve everything. Because I remember growing up, it was always you were either a language arts person or you were a math person. And, the left and the right side of the brain and all of that kind of stuff that sort of like, okay, you're going to be this, but not that. I take it that's not necessarily right.
No, that's not necessarily right. We all have cognitive strengths and weaknesses. That we can say quite confidently. As to whether you're a language arts person or a math person, it turns out that many of these skills apply to both. So, for example, in working memory is another one of the executive functions. It's how we hold information in our minds while we think about it. When I'm reading, I'm taking in pieces of information, I'm holding them in my mind, I'm comparing it to what I already know, which is how I comprehend something and how it makes sense. That's working memory. All of that happens in working memory. If I'm in a multi-step math problem and I'm trying to figure out, first I have to distribute and then I have to regroup and then I have to do whatever it is that I do in math, that's working memory. Even basic counting. If you think about, if I asked you to count the books in your office, it would take you a little while, I can tell from looking behind you, but you would have to keep track of which ones you've counted, where you are in the sequence, which ones you haven't counted. That's also working memory. And so that's how all of these play into, and so when we struggle with reading or math, it's not a simple one-on-one correlation where we say, oh, that must be the culprit. We have to dig deeper because we're not going to be able to figure it out otherwise.
Let's kind of move now to something you had talked about, which follows this, I think, in my brain it does, is that there is, I don't know, maybe a disconnect between the concept of understanding how you learn and how you teach. And teaching isn't necessarily learning. And does that mainly, or can that mean that we just can't let everything be in the hands of the school? We need to be in there too.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of teaching that goes on all around all the hundreds of thousands of schools that there are, and the millions of teachers and the tens and hundreds of millions of students that are out there. But it's still the case that only about a third of students are reading proficiently at grade level in fourth grade. So there's obviously teaching going on without learning going on. And we also know that learning goes on no matter what. Kids learned a lot of things during COVID. May not be what the teachers wanted them to learn, but they learned a lot of things. We put a lot of emphasis on teaching, and long time ago, when I was in the high school classroom teaching foreign language, I knew my material. I knew what they had to learn. I could explain it in the way that I understood it, but I didn't necessarily have anything in my toolkit when my students struggled because I didn't know how they learned. And so, when I think that we put a lot of emphasis on teaching, and teaching is important, but if there's no learning going on, it doesn't matter how much teaching is going on. And I think that one of the things that's really important is to change concept or change the way we talk about teaching, because it's not just presenting material. What it really is, my job as a teacher, this is how I look at it, is to create an environment and an experience in which learning can happen. So I don't even need to know what I'm teaching necessarily, as long as I can create that environment and that experience that lets students build that understanding and those connections for themselves.
The impact of increasing your cognitive functions, skills, that reaches out to more than just book learning in schools, doesn't it? It kind of can reach out to your whole life and how you deal with life.
Right. So all of these processes are not just about how we do when we're sitting in the classroom, how we do everything. So we go back to working memory, which we talked about in the context of math, and we talked about in the context of reading. What's happening now in our conversation is you're listening and you're thinking about it and you're coming up with another question. And that's happening in working memory. That's you're pulling out pieces of information you may have experienced or read about or something from your own experience. And that's what I'm doing too. I'm thinking about what the question you're asking me, and I'm thinking about the parents who might be listening and what might be, really helpful information for them. And all of that is going to guide what I'm talking about and what I'm sharing. And that's just a simple example. When we just are, you're talking with your friends. Do you want to go to the pizza place or the hamburger place? Well, you got to think about that, and that's in working memory. And then you got to take into account whether you think your friend who's asking you really has a preference. And you can't do that unless you can process all that kind of information.
Is there a way to strengthen that? Is there a working memory, Peloton machine? Something that kind of
it's not Peloton machine. Yeah. So there is a cognitive training tool. And it's sort of like cross training, which Peloton also is in some respects. So for many, many years, people have known about how to do this in a clinical setting, where you would go and you'd work with a therapist, and it might be a speech pathologist, it might be a vision developmental expert, it might be an occupational therapist. And what we have been working on and have been doing for the last